Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you for your continued and hopefully continuing support of the Maine World Affairs Council. I have the distinct pleasure and privilege of first introducing and then talking with Sean Stein, the president of the U.S. China Business Council. He most recently served as the board chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in China and is the chair emeritus of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. He also co-chaired the China public policy practice at Covington and Burling, where he advised international businesses on political risk, public affairs, communications, and U.S. China government relations. He regularly assisted companies to resolve acute or long-term issues in China and to navigate challenges caused by conflicting U.S. and Chinese policies and perceptions. Sean previously served for nearly 3 decades as a U.S. diplomat, including as Consul General in Shenyang and Shanghai. He also served at the China desk at the State Department, at the former Consul General in Chengdu, and in other positions around the Indo-Pacific. He speaks Mandarin and Indonesian, and is a graduate of Georgetown University. So without further ado, Sean, I leave it to you.
Great, thanks. Let me ask, okay. How about I stand?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, do you want to speak?
The question is, can you guys hear me in the back? No? Okay, all right, then I will sit. All right, okay. Okay, at some point I may have to stand, but we'll start sitting. That was very gracious, thank you. First of all, I just cannot tell you how delighted I am to be here. You know, I spend a lot of time talking about China, but it always has to be sort of the really nitty-gritty about what's happening with sort of trade deals or investment projects, and to be able to sort of talk more generally about China, it really is a privilege. And so thanks for the invitation. And I have to say, I'm totally blown away by this group. First of all, I see Bob Poole in front of me. Bob Poole changed my life when I was a diplomat based in northeastern China, and he was running a big office in Beijing. And he told me there was something that just could not be done and should not be done. And I then made it my mission to prove that it could be, and that changed my trajectory in certain ways. And then I hope everybody knows Judith and Greg Fergan. Does everybody know Judith and Greg? If you don't, I worked with them in Jakarta when, hands down, that was a big embassy, right? Over 100 Americans there. Without a doubt, if there was the election or the vote for the most admired couple in family, that would have absolutely been them. And so anyway, great to have them here. And now I also have just spoken Chinese with a number of you whose Chinese is way better than mine, and their Indonesian is way better than mine, and I'm from Idaho, so all of your English is probably better than mine. So what I'm going to try and do, and I'm going to just set a timer because I want to make sure I don't go too long, so I really want to get to Q&A. One of the things that is just an extraordinarily frustrating experience is, and I suspect anyone that's got some experience in some field, and I don't know if it's advanced physics, or it's a geography, or it's trade, or whatever. You spend a lot of time sort of yelling at the TV and crinkling up the newspaper and sort of throwing it away because everything feels like the coverage is just off. Or in particular with someplace like China, it's often really not just wrong, but wrong in just sort of empirical, provable sorts of ways. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and talk about what do we all get wrong about China. And I'm going to do that because after I talk about what we get wrong about China, I want to talk about where we are in the U.S.-China trade conflict and how maybe some of the misconceptions that we commonly have about China have led us to where we are in this current position with China. So if that sounds fair, I'm going to launch into it. Fair? Okay, first of all, I need to baseline. Who has been to China? This is great. Who has been to China in the last 5 years? Good. All right, excellent. Who was in China 10 years ago? Okay. 15 years ago? And then 20 years ago? Okay, great. So one of the just most amazing things is I spent a lot of time talking to people like Chris on Capitol Hill, or their bosses, members of the House and Senate. And I've come to realize that often when I'm having these meetings and we're talking about China, I feel like I'm talking to living time capsules. And sometimes I can tell exactly when someone was in China because they want to tell me everything that's going on in China. I'm like, oh yeah, you were there in about 2010? Yeah, how did you know? Oh, well, okay. Or you were there in about 2000, right? So there are these different periods in Chinese history. And often what happens, especially with people who do policy because they're on the Hill, or they're in and out of government, they just sort of take what they learned on these really important visits and trips, and then they just sort of extrapolate that forward as if the world has changed, but China has not. So I want to talk about some things that maybe we get wrong a lot about China, and I want to do it really fast so I can bring us up to speed on trade and where we are, and then hopefully we can talk about geopolitics and other stuff in Q&A. So the first thing that I get a lot, I just had this actually yesterday, today's Thursday, Tuesday, did a couple of member briefings on the Hill, including for a member that's on his former committee. And there's this endless perception, and the media feeds this, that either China's economy is so strong, it is this industrial behemoth, that it and its industry will eat up the earth, and it will destroy American business and global business. Or China is on the verge of collapse. And yesterday it was, China is on the verge of collapse. And if we continue to pressure China, they will be so afraid of collapse that they will do what we want them to do. So rule of thumb number one, China and its economy is never as bad as you either think or may hope it is, and it's never as good as you hope or think it might be. And that applies if you're in business and you're doing forecasting, if you're reading the news, anytime you read that, oh, China is failing or China is taking over the world, just realize it's not. Now, there are things that do make it feel like that, right? I mean, we may have just seen, China's, I don't know what their final number is, but going into December, if you look at their annual trade figures, their global trade surplus, so not global trade, but their surplus was $1.2 trillion. That's a really big number. And so their annual number is going to be higher than maybe 1.3, 1.4. So they do have some really big things, but they also have some real challenges. None of the challenges are enough to cause regime instability or to make it look like the government is going to have to act in one way or another. But bear in mind, anytime you read, that's the first one. Second one, I want to talk a little bit about why business is there. Mostly I want to talk about why business isn't there, or the reasons that business is there that aren't what people think. I just saw and had to react to someone in the administration who was talking about China and what they want to accomplish with China. And the first thing they said was, well, we can't have companies going to China, and they're going to China because of two things. Because of cheap labor and because of lax environmental standards. Has anybody heard that? China has cheap labor? No. Who here believes that China has cheap labor? China does not have cheap labor. Nobody now invests in China because of cheap labor. Nobody invests in China for cheap labor. Nobody. There are too many other places you can invest that have genuinely cheap labor. And as far as environmental concerns go, I got back from Beijing and Shanghai 10 days ago, and had a roundtable with China-based CEOs of European and American businesses. And we were talking about all the stuff that's happening sort of in the world and in China. And one of the ones that sort of mentioned was just sort of the new challenge for them is that China's environmental regulations were, quote, worse than the Netherlands. Even the Scandinavians are not as hard on us as the Chinese are. And so it's absolutely true that a decade ago or 15 years ago, you could go to China and you could pollute and you could put stuff in the river and you could put it up in the air. Those days are gone. And it's not just for foreign companies, it's for everybody. So companies are not in China because they think they can produce super cheaply because of labor, and they're not in China because they think they can pollute the environment, because the absolute opposite is true. The last thing that goes along with this, and again, this is something I hear a lot when I'm talking with people in the administration, when we talk about decarbonization. They're like, China is the problem. And it's true, China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. But make no mistake, China's decarbonization campaign is real, and it is affecting every major business in China, domestic or foreign or imported. It's a massive thing. So to think that China's not working on this problem in a way that I think perhaps no other country is just not correct. And we could get into that in just a moment. And so, but that doesn't mean there's not something to the China labor story. There's certain industries that you can look at sort of how they operate and look at parallels across different countries. And one of those industries is the chemical industry. And the reason why the chemical industry is good is because so much of the chemical industry, it is just capital investment, right? And if you build a factory in Houston for petrochemicals, or you build it in Guangdong, or you build it in Dubai or in Malaysia, it's going to be the same equipment, probably from the same companies, probably working in almost exactly the same sort of way. And this is one place where China's labor has an advantage. So we have an American company that's building a $1.2 billion phase one of a petrochemical plant. They're building an almost identical plant currently in Houston. And they've been planning a similar plant in Europe. And so when you ask them to say, well, can you compare, how long does it take? Often, permitting is a problem in the US or other places. What's it like building a plant in the US versus China? And what was interesting to me was the answer, and this you can extrapolate this across a number of industries, is the difference isn't necessarily in permitting or anything else, but they build it faster in China. And the question is, why do they build it faster in China? Why can you build it faster in China? I said, well, I'll tell you. I was leading our project to build this in Houston, and when we get to certain points of the project, we might need 30 pipe fitters that are certified, or we might need 50 technical welders that are certified and trained, and there just aren't 50 certified welders that we can bring onto this project. And so we deal with 10 or we deal with 15, and we run, one shift, and we run them on, overtime and on weekends, but that's the best we can do. He says, when I'm building the factory in Guangdong, I can get my 30 pipe fitters and I get my 25 certified welders, and I can get enough that I can run them 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. And I'm paying them almost as much as I'm paying them in the US, but I can get the workers that we need. And so the workforce is one reason why people are in China. That makes a very big difference. Another thing which I wanted to sort of just mention, which I think is, I hope that has now been sort of completely debunked by experience and knowledge. But again, I still run across this idea that China can't really innovate. China can copy, China can rip off IP, China can be a fast follower, but China doesn't really sort of innovate. And anytime you see something that implies that, or you see a policy that's based upon a premise that you can stop China from innovating and advancing, then you can get that there's going to be a problem. And so an example of this is back when I was chairman of AmCham in Shanghai. I was having a roundtable, and one of the questions we ask is, what keeps you up at night? And what do you guys think? What keeps people up at night? If you're running a big business in China, any ideas?
Finances.
What's that?
Finances.
Finances, okay. Mm-hmm.
Unfair competition.
Unfair competition, good win. What else?
Tariffs from the U.S.
Yeah, big win, yeah.
Intervention of the party.
Intervention of the party, yeah. All those are great answers, right? So the number one thing was what you said. And that was the number one issue they were worried about is U.S. China relations, right? Because that affects you in so many ways. It affects whether people are willing to work for you, whether people are willing to buy your product. Also, if you're going to have export control, that affects a lot of things. But you know what number 2 was? And only by about 2% less? Fear of Chinese competition. And so that was an interesting answer that we knew was the case, because you're talking about this constantly. And so what we decided to do is we decided to do a survey and figure out, what does that mean? And if you're afraid of Chinese competition, how is that affecting you? And so the way we boiled this down in a question was, okay, competition. What are Chinese companies good at that make them competitive? And what are you good at that makes you hopefully more competitive? And we came up with 10 metrics. And the answers were not encouraging. So now, mind you, this is being answered by the China president of major US multinationals. So where were we doing better? With something like 89% of the, I should have brought the stats, but about 89% said our products are better. Great. The other place, which is about 80%, said our product design systems are better. And what that means is it means when we're designing the product, we're building in safety, we're building in recyclability, we're building in processes so that, it's going to be a product that we don't have to do a lot of modification for. So about 80-something%. Every other metric, every one of the 8 other metrics, the American companies assessed, the plurality of them assessed, obviously it was varied, but a plurality assessed that Chinese companies were better. And what were those? Speed to market. The numbers were turned. 80% said Chinese companies are better at speed to market. Adoption of new technology, 70%, 71% said China is better and faster at adopting and implementing new technology. An obvious one, better at getting permits and regulations, right? Adapting products to like the local marketplace, et cetera. But what it means is the days when American companies can go into China and have an unequivocal advantage because of processes, et cetera, are gone. And now that has largely evaporated in some industries, and others it sort of persists. So when American companies went into China 50 years ago or 40 years ago, the Chinese government required them to have a joint venture partner. And the joint venture partner was uniformly seen as a millstone, right? You had the joint venture partner because you had to do business, but it didn't actually bring very much to the table other than hassle, expenses, pain, suffering, and I suspect Bob could tell you 10 other horrible things they brought along with that. But those days are now gone. And so what we're seeing increasingly is now when global companies, American, European, Japanese, and otherwise, are now expanding in China, often they're seeking out joint venture partners because they bring strengths to that partnership and to that relationship. And often that's their key to being able to be successful competitively. So anyone who tells you or implies that China's companies are not innovative gets it wrong. In fact, sometimes when I talk about this with groups, I've got a series of what my team calls the skull slides or the skull and crossbones slides, right? I suspect many of you grew up like I did, watching cartoons on Saturday morning, right? And anytime you saw a bottle and it had a skull and crossbones on it, what did that mean? Poison. It means danger, right? And so we've got a series of slides that are our skull and crossbones slides. And it shows U.S. versus China. Net dollar R&D spending. China has surpassed the United States. So there's this gap in it that shows China's spending more than the U.S., and it's got the skull there. Danger. That's a problem. Then if you look at it in purchasing power parity terms, it's even worse. It's bigger. If you look at the number of STEM graduates, they're producing dramatically more than we are. That's a problem. If we want to be competitive, we need to figure out what to do about that. But again, we've got this gap and a big skull that goes between it. If you look at total number of patents, absolutely there are flaws in the patent system and all that, but China has more patents per year than the United States does. And now increasingly, if you look at the reports on scientific papers that are cited, and there's this interesting index that academics would be able to describe better than me that shows what papers are getting published in various cutting edge fields that are getting cited by other papers. Chinese papers are now ahead of U.S. papers. And so all of these should be flashing signs for members of Congress, for the administration, that if we want to remain on top of these areas, then we've got work to do. Let me just talk about one more thing before I go to where we are in the trade war. And that is tech and AI. And this is because one of the things we hear about a lot right now is the race in artificial intelligence. And the Chinese need for U.S. semiconductors and chips. And there's a little bit of truth to this. And I apologize if some of you have heard this, but there's this kind of joke that you hear all the time in China that's not really a joke because it's kind of like, well, sort of true. But they say that the AI race and competition is not between the Chinese and the Americans. Have you guys heard this? Has anybody heard this? Okay. The AI competition is between the Chinese in China and the Chinese in America. And I can tell you, I work with a lot of AI companies. There's a lot of truth in that, right? If you look at the heads of the product development teams at the major US firms, whether it's OpenAI and Microsoft or Meta or others, there's a lot of truth in that. But the approaches are different. In October, I was in China, and by dumb luck, I got invited to a closed-door roundtable discussion that brought together the founders of some of China's leading sort of tech companies, right? So they had the co-founder of DeepSeek, which is China's AI LLM. It's, well, not even its leading, but its best known AI LLM. It had the founder of Unitree, which is by far their most advanced sort of humanoid robotics, dog robotics sort of company. Maybe world leader, but in any case, absolutely cutting edge. One that does brain implants, another one does, anyway, these sort of leading tech companies. And it was a discussion about, where's technology going? What about artificial intelligence and all of that? And it went on for a ridiculously long time, like 2.5 hours. But the discussion was like amazing. And you know what I did not hear once in that entire discussion? Despite all of the talk about AI, you know what I didn't hear once? I did not hear once the need to push AI frontier technologies. I did not hear, okay, I did hear once, only once, the race for AGI. Instead, what I heard was this obsessive focus on pushing out AI into every possible industrial and consumer and scientific application imaginable. So that's the race that China is running, is how do we get AI into every company and every sort of operation, and how do we then use AI to drive value, productivity, et cetera, as opposed to how do we run the race for AGI. Last thing, which I think you'll hear a lot about, and I end up talking a lot about this in Washington, is the administration made a very controversial decision to sell certain advanced semiconductors chips to China. Most recently, the H200, before that, the H20, and now there's a debate about other sort of chips. The thing that's the most interesting about this, and I can tell you that the administration gets this wrong as well, is there's this belief, mistaken belief, that the Chinese government desperately wants to get more US chips, more H200s, more H20s, because they want to use this to power their AI industry. That is wrong. The Chinese government, it's divided. Certain ministries would like more, others would like less. But overall, that's not an ask of the Chinese government of US trade negotiators. But it's something that some of the US trade negotiators have in their head that they can offer to the Chinese to get some great sort of concessions. So what is it the Chinese want? Chinese companies, make no mistake, they want access to those chips. And they want them because they want to be able to serve up videos more effectively. They want to be able to serve up, certainly AI applications more effectively, et cetera. But none of the companies that are dealing with Chinese national security are going to touch an NVIDIA or an Intel or an AMD chip. Just isn't going to happen. So it's not to develop their military, it's to develop their business. But parts of the Chinese government, that's not their priority. Their priority is developing a parallel system or an alternative ecosystem. And the more companies are reliant on US chips, the less market unless they're reliant on Chinese chips. And so when I talk to Chinese companies that are either involved in AI or they're hyperscalers, right? It's really interesting. What they'll tell me is that they will actually have to run 3 tech stacks. They'll have to run basically the Huawei chip stack and CTX and others that are Chinese made, not because they want to, but because the Chinese government will make them do that. And if they don't have a Chinese tech stack, then they'll have a difficult time getting permission to buy and use US chips. But the problem is they also need an alternative because they aren't convinced they will forever be able to buy US chips, so they need to have an alternative. And they don't like Huawei. They don't like the company. They don't like working with them. So they'll have a third tech stack, which would be an x86-based stack that they'll also run so that they've got options and optionality. But so one of the mistakes that we've seen, or one of the challenges we've seen, is that on several moments, the administration has expected to secure great concessions from the Chinese by giving them chips, when the Chinese government just doesn't really, that's just not what's motivating them. But let me just talk about one more thing with AI, and then I'm going to talk about where we are in the trade conflict. And this is what scares me about Chinese competition. And I think for me, this is really emblematic of the different approach to AI. I was organizing a shock and awe tour for some visiting companies for a visiting group of executives from the United States. And what the local team asked me to do is that, shock and awe. Show them that, what sort of Chinese. And so I took them to show them a lot of really interesting things, like, dark factories, almost fully automated warehouses that are dark, and fully automated almost, automotive manufacturing and all the things that we hear about. And then I took them to a place that was a little bit outside of town. As we drive up, it looks like an airplane hangar with a lot of air handlers on top. And as you go in and you go through the whole clean room thing, And it's something that most of them had never seen before. And this was a group of pharmaceutical executives. It is an airplane hangar, clean room, that's filled with, I forget the number, like 9,800 fully automated wet labs. And what does that mean? It means they've got almost 10,000 research stations that run 24 hours a day doing things like what? Measuring crystalline structures and crystalline decay, and measuring the binding surface of enzymes and folding enzymes, and looking at how different reactions improve, and optimizing reactions in chemistry. And why do they do that? They do that for two reasons. They do that because it's really great for like drug discovery, but also what they're really doing is they're collecting billions of data points that can then be fed into AI for prediction. And so they've got three of these facilities. One is specializing in special materials. One is specializing in drug discovery, enzymes, synthetic biology. And another one is for like chemicals in the chemical industry. And so when I took a group of pharmaceutical executives, including the global head of research for a top 3 pharmaceutical company, it took him all of about 30 seconds after being in there and looking at the types of data they were collecting to say, we might have the equivalent of 10 of these. And if we don't get access to this kind of data, we're just not going to be competitive very far out. So if you look last year, if you look at licenses of molecules, in other words, when you're getting ready to do drug trials, you start with a molecule. And if you look at licensing for those to go into testing, 37% of those came from China. Most of the rest came from the US, a couple from Europe, a couple from Japan. This year so far, the number is more than 50% of them have come from China because of things like this. So all that is to say, China does pose a really significant competitive and other threat to the United States that we need to be smart about how we confront. So let me go from there, and someone was supposed to give me a 15-minute mark. You're fired, Ted. All right, mark down his grade. Fired. Okay, I'm just going to do a very quick where are we on the trade war, if that's all right, and then we'll go to Q&A. Okay, I'm going to give you the world's fastest history of the U.S. China trade war. Is that all right? Okay, it's going to go fast. So if you have to go back for questions, we'll do that. Okay, so President Trump comes in, and on the first day he's in office, he signs the America First trade policy. The America First trade policy says we're going to do all of these sort of studies and look at how trade is affected mostly by China but others, and then based upon these studies, we are going to have, starting on April 2nd, we're going to have a series of new tariffs and other things perhaps targeting China to help us bring industrialization back to the United States. Big problem with that was I don't think Trump actually read it, because despite the fact that folks from the White House and USTR both called me the day it was signed to emphasize how much they wanted to work with the business community on this and wanted to have consultation and to not worry, nothing would happen until April. 72 hours later, we were threatening tariffs on Colombia, and 72 hours after that on Mexico and Canada, the next day on China, and the whole thing sort of melted down. So what happened? So fast forward, the U.S. puts 10% tariffs on China for fentanyl. A lot to be said about fentanyl. If you're interested, we'll talk later. So what happens when the U.S. does that? In Trump 1.0, the U.S. put a lot of tariffs on China during Trump 1.0. And at that time, what China would do is China was surprised, China wasn't prepared, and China wanted to take the moral high ground. And so it was always just ridiculous. You know, and say, we are the defenders of the global trade system. And in a way they were, but China's never really been the defenders of the global trade system. And so he would, but when they would retaliate against the US, they would look at what the US did and they would try really hard to sort of match it and maybe go down 1%, but absolutely to not escalate. And that was the story of Trump 1.0. So Trump 2.0 comes in, and what happens? The US puts 10% tariffs on China, and they do the same thing. They sort of meet us at about the same level, but then they do something really interesting. They say, look, the trade war is a war with multiple fronts, and the fronts go beyond simply tariffs. And so after that, they would then announce a couple of investigations into some U.S. companies, maybe anti-dumping, maybe anti-competitive, but investigate some U.S. companies. They would sanction a couple of U.S. companies, and then they would also maybe add some new export controls. And so they would meet us and they would escalate on other fronts. So fast forward 6 weeks, the U.S. puts another 10% on China, and lo and behold, they do the same sort of thing, and that becomes the pattern. And then we get to Liberation Day, and I think Many of you have seen the Great Decisions Guide. What is it? The Great Decisions book? All right. We're going to have one of the, what's the opposite of great decision? Disastrous decisions? Someone who did not go to public school in Idaho, what's the opposite of great decision? Okay, all right, I will take that one. All right. And so we get to Liberation Day, and Liberation Day comes, and the U.S. announces Liberation Day tariffs on China. And they say, now, don't retaliate. Now, anyone that's spent a nanosecond talking to the Chinese government knows that the Chinese government has said, look, we're going to tell you from the beginning, there are just two things that we will not abide. Number one, we will not be bullied, and we will be respected. And so there is no universe in which the Chinese were not going to retaliate, and we, of course, told the administration they're going to retaliate. And we were told, no, no, no. So, of course, the Chinese retaliate. So what does the U.S. do? The U.S. retaliates, and so China retaliates again. And what was happening, and this is where, what was your phrase? Dumb decisions. The president, I'm hearing this in real time from people at the White House. People are telling the president, if you raise the tariff high enough, remember the very first thing we said about China's economy? China's economy is so fragile and their system is so weak that if you raise the tariff high enough, the Chinese are going to fold. They're going to cave. And it didn't work out like that. And anyone who had really known and dealt with the Chinese would have known that it wouldn't have worked out like that. But this is how you get up to triple-digit tariffs. And then that doesn't really work out very well for either country. So what happens? We need to figure out how do we get out of this conundrum? And you have the who's going to call whom, and we have a couple of weeks of, well, is Trump going to call first? No. Is President Xi going to call first? No. So we start trying to negotiate. Well, maybe you can write letters, something. Eventually, they agree to meet in Geneva, and so they meet in Geneva, and tariffs get rolled back. But we quickly realize that there's a problem, and the problem then gets magnified, and so then we have to meet in London to talk about it. And that doesn't fix it, so then we meet in Stockholm, and that doesn't fix it. And so then what happens is the administration realizes that there are some things they want to talk about with China. So they call the Chinese and they say, look, can we meet in Madrid? And a lot was going on at the time, and the Chinese were like to say, yeah, okay, we'll meet in Madrid. And they go to Madrid, and the U.S. says, we've got some important things we want to talk about. We want to talk about rare earths, we want to talk about export controls, and we want to talk about TikTok, because the TikTok deal expires next week. And what does the Chinese say? They say, you know what? We don't want to talk about that until we talk about Geneva. And the problem with Geneva is the two sides did not agree on what they agreed to. So the U.S. says the only thing, right? Anyone who here has worked in the U.S. government? Okay, right? The U.S. side said the only thing that the U.S. side could say, and that is, the U.S. negotiating position was, we will roll back tariffs and everything to pre-Liberation Day. And that's what we're going to do. But, and this was probably unsaid, but we will always take steps to protect our national security. You can never say, we're not going to protect our national security. And so what does that mean? Maybe we'll do sanctions. Maybe we will do export controls. We'll protect our national security, but we will call a truce on tariffs. Well, the Chinese say, well, you know what? We told you we would not even go to Geneva if we're not going to roll everything back and just freeze everything. And when you talk to the Chinese, they are convinced that's what we agreed to, and the U.S. side is absolutely convinced that this is what we agreed to. So the two sides have this disagreement. Now, how they got in that place, I don't know. But that went through multiple meetings. And so they get to Madrid, and the Chinese say, we have to resolve this first. And the U.S. says, again, the only thing you could say as a U.S. negotiator is, we will never stop protecting our national security. Right? You can't say anything else. And you can't do anything else. You can't stop protecting national security. So the Chinese said, okay, then we too will reserve that right. But something else changed at the same time. First thing they said, and this apparently made the U.S. side quite unhappy. They said, there must be a Chinese proverb for this, and I'm sure Bob will know it, probably in classical Chinese, that is, essentially, as ye sow, so ye shall reap. And so the Chinese said, okay, we too will protect our national security, and if you define national security as upholstered wooden furniture and kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities, then national security. The Chinese side did not, the U.S. side did not like that. And then they said something else that was really important. And they said, okay, but now we reserve the right to sort of retaliate when you take steps at the time and place and manner of our choosing. So I was in China at this point and was talking to the Chinese right after this discussion. And what the Chinese then liked to talk about then is that they had moved to what they were calling the hot stove approach. And so just like America has got its China hawks, China has its America hawks. And what the America hawks have been saying in China from the beginning is, why do we have this conflict with China, with the United States? It is because we have never demonstrated to the United States that we have agency. And what does that mean? We dance when the US does something, but we don't ever do anything to sort of push back, and we never dance first. And they didn't actually ever really drive the conversation, but they did move us to what they're now calling this hot stove approach. And what that is who here has kids? Who here was a kid? All right. Who here's still a kid? All right. You touch a hot stove, and what happens? Right. And do you do it again? Okay, I did, but most of you probably didn't, right? Again, I was from Idaho, so and so that was then how the retaliatory doctrine changed. It went from meeting the U.S. with no escalation to meeting the U.S. with minor escalation to the idea that China's retaliation could be unbound as they saw fit. They could implement the stove theory, and so right after. About 10 days after Madrid, the U.S. did what we always do, and it was very, picayune, very normal, right? We sanctioned a number of companies around the globe. I forget how many there was total, like 40 some odd companies around the globe. There were some Russian companies and different ones. And in that group of 40 some odd companies that were sanctioned, 21 of them were from China. I can guarantee you that not even Bob has heard of any of those Chinese companies. They are not significant, they are not big players, and they're guilty of doing what? Diverting stuff to Russia, or attempting to divert stuff to Iran, or fissile material to North Korea and all this, right? Just the normal kind of thing that you do. You sanction companies for that so that you try and deter that. Well, China was ready. Less than 24 hours after the US does this, they're like, hot stove. What does China do? They announce a massive investigation into NVIDIA for violating anti-competition laws. They initiate an anti-dumping investigation to legacy semiconductors, one area the United States is hyper-competitive in, and they go after legacy semiconductors. And then they do something which none of us saw coming, because it didn't actually exist in the past. They announced what was called an anti-discrimination investigation. And that was to identify all the ways the U.S. had discriminated against China's semiconductor industry, but more importantly, if you are like me or you're working with industry, to identify which companies cooperated with the U.S. in discriminating against their industry so that they could be subject to sanction or other types of measures. So this tiny sort of sanction to non-significant Chinese companies to a pretty massive response that would have a pretty significant effect on a lot of U.S. companies. And then, and I'll wrap up with this, then 10 days after that, the U.S. released what was called the affiliates rule. That was billed within the government as this teeny tiny technical fix for a little error in how we've been doing our sanctions policy, and it won't really affect anyone. But in point of fact, it was the most abusive rule that you could imagine in the way it was implemented. But I'll spare you that. But it would have had a very significant effect on China in that the number of companies that were sanctioned in China would at least go up by 8 or 10 times. And so from about 4,000 or 5,000 Chinese companies to at a minimum 30,000 and as many as like 40 or 50,000. So something that is significant for China. And so what does China do? China then, following the rule of the hot stove, they then rolled out just some pretty extraordinarily broad restrictions on rare earths. And that was a problem for a lot of companies. But because I'm trying to wrap up, we will then sort of end that all of that then was causing, we had Stellantis, we had GM, we had Ford, which were having production lines shut down. We had Boeing, which was threatening to shut down some production. We had lots of smaller manufacturers, all these issues because companies couldn't get rare earths. And so we went to Korea, and the two presidents agreed that we would have a truce. And now things are a little bit better, and I'm going to stop there just because I've gone on too long.
Thanks, Sean. That was an outstanding laydown. I want to take the moderator's prerogative and ask one question, and then I want to throw it to the students in the room for the next two. So for mine, I want to pivot to geopolitics. Because I think the other thing that is on people's minds when we talk about China, aside from the trade war, is Taiwan. And I know President Trump and President Xi spoke recently. I saw it seemed interesting that the Chinese readout noted that President Xi, what did he say? He said, the United States must carefully handle arms sales to Taiwan. That felt like a pretty pointed reference to this massive arms sale that came through in December. I think it was the biggest to Taiwan ever. So can you help us understand the risks that the U.S. and China currently see on Taiwan, and how each government may be factoring or assessing those risks into their respective Taiwan policies?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me try and answer it sort of quickly. But again, this is another example of where I think there's some misperceptions about where the risk lies and where the risk doesn't lie with Taiwan. Now, full disclosure, I spent years living in Taiwan. I have great friends in Taiwan. I'll leave it at that. But and I still go to Taiwan regularly. So the interesting thing about Taiwan is this. I remember that in the last election of Taiwan in January 2 years ago, and William Lai gets elected. And what do I see in the press in the United States? That China's arch enemy and arch rival, William Lai from the DPP, has been elected. Terrible things are going to happen. I'm in Beijing, and I'm talking to folks in the Chinese government, in the party, talking to the folks who work on Taiwan, and they were like, "This is the greatest thing ever." No, that's a bit, that's too much, but they were like, "Oh yeah, this is a pretty good outcome," and I'm like, "But what about the arch enemy and all this?" And they're like, "Look, Tsai Ing-wen, the previous president, she won with more than 60% of the vote and a supermajority in their legislature. This guy, William Lai, got 40% and only won because the opposition couldn't pick a candidate, so he was running against two candidates, either one of which would have beaten him handily. And by the way, they lost control of the legislature. Things are going our direction. Things are going great, right?" And so the narrative here was this was sort of the nightmare outcome. And to be clear, the Chinese would have liked a different outcome, but they thought this was actually not half bad. And so in the eyes of the Chinese government, this was progress. The second thing, and I have to confess, I don't know where these statistics came from, but I had then folks who were sort of arguing this with, on the Chinese side. They were showing statistics showing, how youth in Taiwan identified with people in other, in other places, right? And so you do see more, you have more in common with, people your age in, Tokyo or in Seoul or in London or in New York or in LA or in Shanghai. And they're like, these numbers show every year the number gets bigger, that they're saying we've got more in common with Shanghai than, say, New York or LA or Tokyo. And so from the perspective of the Chinese leadership, are they worried? Yeah, but they're kind of winning. Things are kind of going their way. And so when we see people hyperventilating about 2027 or other things, that just isn't right? I mean, are there things that could really cause conflict over Taiwan? Absolutely. If something were to happen that the Chinese saw would be irrevocable, an irrevocable move towards independence or something else, China would be forced to sort of react. But right now, the Chinese realize they've got a lot on their plate, and gambling on Taiwan is a pretty high risk thing that could jeopardize the party, could jeopardize President Xi and all of this. And so Taiwan is something to worry about, something to watch. But if you're a company in sort of East Asia, it's probably not on your top 5 list, and it's probably not even on your top 10 list because of that. But where you worry is you do worry about there'll be some sort of miscalculation. You worry that you'll have U.S. ships sailing this way and Chinese ships sailing this way, and you have it's sort of an issue or a conflict. So the worry then is about unplanned conflict, and the worry is about miscalculation much more than the worry is that there'll be some sort of kinetic action over Taiwan that's launched by choice in the near term by China.
Right. So it seems like you mentioned this kind of this burned hand approach for the trade conflict. It doesn't. It seems like that's fairly siloed in the trade conflict. Like that's not going to kind of find its way into any response that China has on Taiwan.
Yeah, so I think that's what the call was actually about, right? And that is after Korea. Even before Korea, we had this really interesting thing that was happening where, you guys don't, wait, someone here is a sociology student, right? Maybe this is psychology. Projection. What is projection? It's where you take your psychoses and you project it on the other person, right? We had that early on in the trade war, and it was just the most fascinating thing to watch. And that would be the U.S. side right now does not have a coordination mechanism, right? Traditionally, the way that the U.S. government would coordinate amongst itself is we had the National Security Council. And it would mean that when I was doing China, it would mean that 2 days a week, I would spend half my day at the White House with people from every other agency arguing about what should we do on China and how should we do it. And we would do it on every Wednesday and every Friday. And what did that mean? We all had a shared set of facts, and we all had a common approach, and that's how things work. That doesn't happen anymore. It's gone. It's been mostly abolished. In fact, I was just told when I was talking to someone in the NSC now that you could probably count the total number of actual NSC staffers right now on 5 fingers, right? I mean, as opposed to 400 and something back during the last administration. And so this coordination mechanism doesn't exist. And so, what's that? Oh, okay. So where am I going with this? So what was happening then is you would have Scott Bessent, who was leading the negotiations with the Chinese. And he would go and he would talk to the Chinese and say, here's what we're going to do. And then he would go back to Washington, and the Chinese would go back to Beijing. And then maybe, I don't know, somebody like the Department of Commerce would like do something else. And the Chinese would be like, our system, it is inconceivable that you would not be lashed up from top to bottom. What is this devious American plan to say one thing and have this other thing happen? And it was just hurting their negotiators' brains to think that we were not coordinated on the U.S. side. And so we had this projection that was not helpful. But then what happened after Korea is the president realized that this was a problem. So now everything goes through Bessent on the trade, sanctions, export control front. So now that's all controlled by Scott. We don't get freelancing by Commerce or USTR or any of the others. But we also had it going the other way, and this was what was just fascinating to me. At one point, after China put in, this is in early October, this was after the negotiations in Madrid, and after the affiliates rule, the Chinese responded to with this massive series of extraterritorial controls on rare earths. What does the U.S. side say? That wasn't in the spirit of what we talked about in Madrid. Maybe their Ministry of Commerce, kind of like our Department of Commerce, is freelancing on policy, sort of like ours. And so they're out there, well, we think they're freelancing. And we're like, no, that just doesn't happen in the Chinese system. So we had this going on. So what's going on now with Taiwan is this. The Chinese are happy now that the U.S. is coordinated on economic policy, but the way the U.S. has sort of mentally bifurcated policies, you've got economic policy, sanction policy, that bit of national security, all under Bessent, and then you still have sort of the policy free-for-all in all the other areas. And this was the Chinese saying, we want everything to be together because the Chinese don't bifurcate it that way. They look at the relationship with the U.S. and don't say, the U.S. relationship with the U.S. on trade as different from the relationship with the United States on defense or on geopolitics or other things. And so that's what it was really about, is the Chinese sort of making a play saying, look, it's sort of an all or nothing thing. Either we're going to find a way to get along or we're not.
Great.
My name is Vin Grant. I'm a current student here at the University of Southern Maine studying women and gender studies. My question has to do with, it was very clear from your discussion that there's an issue regarding our conception of China across economics, across culture, across language even. Clearly, we are not meeting China where we need to meet them. How do we as students and as global citizens create a more equitable relationship for China for the future?
Yeah, well, what's that? Vote. Okay, vote. Study STEM, right? Or if we're going to actually go head-to-head with China on some of the things, then we need a workforce that can go head to head with China. And that means we need to have the chemists, and we need to have the people who are studying advanced biology, and we need to have the people who can actually build things. And we just don't have those people in those numbers, I think, right now in the United States. And so I think that is the single biggest thing as students is that. The problem is, I mean, you know, I look back and I've got 3 kids, and would I be delighted if my kids were studying, you know, I don't know, molecular biology or, you know, electrical engineering? Yeah, but you know what? That's not what they want to study. And I only have the limited ability to affect what they do study, right? And so I think what's happened is, I think though, as students, I think that would be the thing, is that just making sure we develop the skill sets that we need to be competitive.
Sean, if I could just follow up on that really quickly, because I'm struck by your anecdote earlier about China being able to run, you know, 3 shifts of welders. Would you say that that education and training extends to the trades?
What do you mean, to the trades?
To trades, so like welders, pipe fitters.
Oh, in the States?
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is sort of the problem. And that is, you know, I remember reading this really interesting study, right? We talked about we need to bring manufacturing back to the United States, and we need to have factories and all this. And absolutely, there are things that we need to do that for, right? But then you're like, okay, who actually wants to work in said factories, and who wants their children to work in said factories as opposed to go into, I don't know, private equity or consulting or law or accounting or whatever, right? And so we have this ideal about that. And we have the same sort of ideal about we want to have family farmers. But at the end of the day, that's really hard work, and it doesn't always pay really well. And so people don't actually want, in many cases, not in all cases, but to be family farmers. And so I think we have this intellectual ideal of what our society should look like and how our economy should be structured. But that ideal doesn't actually match sort of the preferences that people have. And, you know, welcome to life in a democracy.
Thanks.
Okay.
Another question for the...
Okay, we'll get one here and then we'll go up in the back.
Hi, my name is Lake. I'm a sociology student. I'm going to read what I have written here. It's kind of a half-formed question. I hope that's all right. I hope you can get to where I'm going with it. Culture, I'm a sociology student, like I said. What I want to do with that is studying culture and cults and what beliefs eventually get to politics. And so culture affects politics down the line. I think I heard that you worked with or were connected to Shenyang. And I might have been wrong in that. My understanding is that they are paid for in preaching a history of China via Falun Gong, which then becomes many Americans' understanding of Chinese culture. So I was wondering, how does that affect greater politics, and how should an average person address this with people who they know when these facts are brought into political conversation, and like facts around that? Because that's something that I deal with a lot, where like if somebody goes and watches Shenyang, for example, and then they're coming back and they're like, well, I just watched this, and this is what is going on in China right now. So like, let's have a political conversation with this as the basis of cultural background versus actual reality.
Yeah, so let me just I'm going to sort of twist this just a little bit, because I do think that certainly there's a cultural aspect to foreign policy and all of that, right? But I think if I expand it beyond just sort of culture to sort of like baseline beliefs, I think that particularly on the China side, a lot of China's policy, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy or how they engage with the United States and all this, is driven by some core beliefs that I think you find around a lot of China. And so if we look at China, I don't want to ask too much, I want to ask everyone how old you are, but I realize that's politically incorrect. So let us say that we are a group of Chinese who are all born, say, late 70s, early 80s, which is a huge percent of the population, right? That's people who are, 40 plus years old. What has your life been in China? Your life in China has been, with a few sort of setbacks that probably didn't affect you, your life has been getting better pretty much consistently, right? The economic growth in China over that period has been somewhat consistent and has been extraordinarily impressive. And so you, by human nature, you're going to extrapolate back and say, here's where we were, here's where we are, and therefore, you forecast. And it's like, things are going to keep getting better, right? And so there's now this very much hardwired into much of Chinese society that, you know what, we are rising and we're going to continue to rise. And maybe they are. But they also, the other part of that, which I think is now baked into some of the Chinese psyche, partly because of sort of propaganda, partly because of news coverage and all that, is that the corollary to China rising is the West in decline, and in permanent and perpetual decline. And if that's what you believe, and this is hardwired for a lot of people at this point, then you're going to make certain policy choices based upon your belief that the West is in decline and that you're going to continue rising. In some ways, that's dangerous for us. In other ways, that's actually great when we prove them wrong. But I do think that a lot of Chinese policies can be traced to this belief that they will inevitably rise.
Hello, my name is Antonio Tella. I am a political science and criminology major here at USM. My question also surrounded like education, and it's okay if you don't know the answer to this. I was wondering if there was like work around Washington to like close this achievement gap that seems like China has over the U.S., even in STEM and like even like more like what's the term? I forgot. These more like I like having like civil engineers and stuff like of that capacity. If there's work to do in that, and also like I think there was like chatter in the room about like China just like having the capability of doing that and we don't. I feel a lot of the achievement gap is just like due to overfunding. I feel like we live in a country that people are like very capable and have a lot of things. I think a lot of people are not given the opportunity. I rep in Maine and I got the chance to like also like live like up north in Maine and a lot of other stuff. I've met a lot of capable people who never had the opportunity to study and work those things. So I was wondering if there's like general work or like a culture that like wants to move like a more competent, educated America.
Yeah, I don't know if we're more competent, but you know, one of the lessons that was just shocking to me when I first lived in China in the 90s, I was living in Chengdu, which is, for those of you who know Chinese geography, far, far southwest, right? The land of pandas, you know, this giant basin carved out of the Himalayas, beautiful, fascinating place. You never see the sun because it's always cloudy because of pollution and other things. And I remember talking to people who were in jobs that were really quite successful and who were doing well. They had college degrees, they were doing other things. And I'd be like, you know what, these people are doing really well. They, you know, compared to others, they are doing well. And then I would see them and they'd be like, oh, hey, you know, I'm leaving. Like, why? I'm going to Shenzhen. I'm going to go find a better job or a better life in Shenzhen, or I'm going to immigrate to Canada, or I'm going to go to the United States. And so there's this constant sort of hunger and belief that you could, by going out and working, you could have a better life and you could improve. And that was very much sort of the China story. And I remember thinking, wow, you know, you've already got so much. Why are you going to risk all of that to go to, you know, Eastern China or to go overseas? I think China's lost a little bit of that, but I do see that has been replaced by sort of faith in education. And the idea that if you go to college and your family and all of your extended family will save for you to go to college and you study the right things, that you will actually get ahead and you'll do better than your parents. And sort of empirically and statistically, historically, that's been true because of the factors I was talking about. And so there's still a lot of belief in that. But when they look around and they say who's been successful and who's done well, it's the people who studied, you know, biology and engineering and all of that. They see that those people did really well. And so that's, I think, where they gravitate to.
Hi, my name's Bill Dunn. There's been a lot of coverage of late in the news about the changes in the top of the military in China, and I was wondering how much attention should we pay to that generally, and especially in relation to Taiwan.
So probably don't need to pay much attention to it. For people like me that live on sort of China and China policy and all that, endlessly fascinating. Has all kinds of things that it means for command and control over the military. It has all kinds of interesting things about military readiness and all of that. But at the end of the day, you know, it's not really going to affect very much in how China sort of works and functions. For those of you who haven't followed that, what happens is China's military is somewhat unique, right? In the United States, the military is part of the U.S. government, right? In China, not so. It is not called the Chinese military. It is called the, anyone?
People's Liberation.
People's Liberation Army. So who does the army work for? All right, who said that? Extra gold stars. All right. It's the party's military. And so the party is not run really by the Minister of Defense in the way that, say, the Secretary of Defense would run it. It's run by the party. And so the head of the military, the uniformed part, is the Central Military Commission. It normally has 7 members on the Central Military Commission. Chair, 2 vice chairs, 4 I don't know, sort of technical sort of folks. And over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of churn on this. People getting sort of fired, disappeared, et cetera, typically for corruption and other types of things on this. And so after the last round of purges and turnover, a lot of people who were seen as being very close and were personally picked by the president got appointed to that group. Now, some of them have disappeared. We assume they're in some sort of interrogation, detention, some sort of party discipline. And now the vice chair, who was, the hero of the Vietnam War with them, and the one guy who's actually been in wars and was handpicked by Xi, he's the guy who now has just been pushed out, Zhang Yousheng. And so people are like, okay, well, this commission that normally would have 7 members that's had all this turnover now kind of has, depending on your count, maybe as few as 2 functioning members. And so this is sort of the Pentagon for China. The leadership has now been sort of self-decapitated. So it's really interesting to watch. But in terms of its impact on U.S. China relations, impact on, business, minimal, but just interesting to see because it does have implications for command control and readiness, right? Because even when they bring in new folks, then you're still not really ready on day one. So, but it's a big deal, yeah.
Thanks. I was surprised to hear you say, unless I got it wrong, that so much of our manufacturing has gone to China not because it's less expensive. I mean, for years, decades, people have said it's made in China because they can do it much less expensively than we can. Did I hear that right, that you said that's not the case?
It's not the case that that's why they're there now. If you roll back the clock
it
to
just
say
now?
2000, right? 2000, actually, the U.S. government was pushing companies to go to places like Malaysia, to China, et cetera. But now nobody goes to China for that, right? Now, if you wanted low cost, you'd go to someplace else. So that's not why companies are there
So it
now.
used to be the case, but it's not.
Oh, yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah. Used to be the case. But
So
not
does
anymore.
a factory worker, a pipe fitter, a welder in China get paid in relative terms as much as they do here?
In relative terms, in purchasing power parity terms, they might get paid more, right? You can have a really nice life in some places being a welder, being that, yeah. But even so, I remember I organized for, this was 2019, just before COVID, had a congressional delegation in town. And so, again, my theme was always when they come, let's go for shock and awe. So I brought, China-based CEOs to have dinner with this group of U.S. senators. And one of the topics was, let's talk about labor and labor costs. And they were like, well, actually, and these were household name companies, like, oh, well, I can tell you that, say, our database managers and our marketing managers and our account managers here in China, yeah, they make the same as our guys do on the west coast of the United States. And so in terms of cost for labor and skilled labor, yeah, it's not cheap. It's good, it's high quality, but it definitely is not cheap. You don't go there because you can get a cheaper, accounting system or whatever. But when you do go there again, not just because you can get welders, but think about some of the big U.S. tech companies that have until recently had big operations in China, even though they couldn't legally operate their products in China. Why were they there? They were there because you could get very high quality programming talent, very high quality research talent. So, you've got research in the US and you can only do so much there. And then the only other place that you could do it at scale would be at China. So I'm not saying that it was never the case they went to China because of lax environment regulations or cheap labor or cheap manufacturing, but those days are long gone. In fact, last meeting I had with a Chinese governor in one of the major provinces that has some of the most foreign investment intensive, investment in the country. And when I was talking with him, he was boasting. I had a delegation with me. He was boasting. He was like, look, do you know how many factories I closed last year? And I was like, no. And it was a really big number, right? I don't remember what it was, but it was a big number. And everyone else around the table was like, oh, you're bragging about closing factories. It's like, yeah, right? We don't want these low value added factories that pollute and they're just labor intensive. They can move to Vietnam. They can move then at the time. They can move to the Philippines. They can move to Malaysia. We don't want those. We want the higher value stuff. And so we don't want, if you want to make shoes, you don't make them here. Go make them somewhere else. You want to make textiles? Yeah, we don't want you. You want to do that? So China's been moving up this value chain. Along with that, wages and other things have increased. And the low value add, or the low wage jobs have moved out to a large extent.
I'll save mine to the end.
I'm Zeke Williams. I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council, and my question would just in some of the misconceptions that we have, either of the China is collapsing or they're rising, a lot of cited stuff is about population demographics, either that the statistics are wrong or that they're not telling the truth on that. And when you were citing like, oh, we have all these skilled labor in this age range, your example of like the 40-year-olds, what's your thoughts on the actual population demographics and how that could affect future, rise, fall? And, in my mind, I'm thinking too, like the bet on AI is because they think that they're going to have a problem with population demographics.
Very perceptive. China's demographics are a challenge. It's a real problem. And in fact, by most estimates, actually, it's falling faster than maybe some of the official statistics might imply. So that's absolutely true. And I think you're right that, I just saw a really interesting statistic about industrial automation. That last year, China installed more industrial manufacturing robots than the rest of the world combined. And yeah, part of that is, one, you need to do that in order to be competitive in China's hyper-competitive environment that's plagued by overcapacity and deflation and all of that. And part of it is because of exactly what you're talking about, is that everyone knows that at some point, probably not for another decade, but you're really going to start feeling more and more this crunch of not having enough workers. And so you do want to move stuff out to, Southeast Asia or to Mexico, and you do want to automate absolutely as much as you can. So yeah, that's all very true. And I think as we all know, right, if you have a declining population, this is just sort of a mathematical equation, right? There is only one way you're going to increase GDP if you have a declining population, right? And that is increasing productivity, right? And how do you increase productivity? You increase sort of capital per worker, you automate, you bring in AI, and you do all of that. And China's doing that pretty aggressively.
I'm going to invoke my privilege and turn it to foreign policy of foreign policy. This question is actually for Chris. I want to ask about, my understanding is that China has a very risk-averse foreign policy, which keeps it from perhaps playing the role that the United States would traditionally play in terms of the mediator, the provider of good offices, the intervener. And I'm asking this because coming from a Middle Eastern studies background, I know that in the Arab world there's this hunger for China to come in and sort of play a balancing role. Can you comment a little bit on what you see as the trajectory of China's foreign policy interest beyond its relationship with the United States?
Yeah. So the United States, a lot of the U.S. sort of foreign policy and its global relations, came out of the lessons learned after World War II, right? The ideas of collective security, of having alliances, of having, mutual defense sort of pacts and all of that. China doesn't come from that background at all and doesn't have a political tradition of that. And so, one of the things that the U.S. often points to is China does not have traditional allies, and China does not want to have a system of traditional allies. But what China does have, though, is China has interests. And increasingly, China has tools short of maybe developing alliances that can help them get sort of those interests. And in some cases, it's relatively benign. They'll bring in investment for railroads or for other projects, and it's relatively benign, and then countries will be like, okay, well, we'll do more with you because we're seeing these benefits. Other times, it's much more malign, where China has got sort of a track record of using economic coercion to punish or to try and enforce what it wants to do. So, you could go through this long list of, the Philippines at one point, Vietnam, Australia, currently with Japan, etc. And so what China is doing, I think, isn't trying to replace the U.S. I think in many places what they're trying to do is to displace the U.S. If I look at sort of China's foreign policy objectives over the last decade, I think 3 of them that stand out is the desire to drive a wedge between the U.S. and its Pacific alliances, or sort of in the in the lingo, the first island chain. In other words, how do you separate the strong U.S. security relationship with Japan and with Korea? And they've worked very hard at finding ways to do that, and have been more successful, I think, at helping to divide Japan from Korea, but they focused on that. The second one, I don't know which one is second, but I'll choose. The second one is they don't really like the concept of Europe very much. And so they've always had a bit of an allergy of dealing directly with, say, Brussels. And so their strategy has always been, how do we deal with the Europeans as individuals? So they organized things like the 17+1, and then it became the 15+1, and the 13+1, and now it's probably like the 7+1, but the dialogue that they have with various European countries. But the idea was, how do they keep Europe from unifying in a way that it can then counterbalance or resist some of the things that China wants? And their other big third foreign policy objective was to drive a wedge between the U.S. and NATO and U.S. and the Atlantic alliances. And that's all very important to them. The other thing that's been very important to them is they have growing sort of trade interests and trade needs, the same as, the U.S. and other countries, defending sort of, they call them SLORCs, sea lines of control, right? Making sure that, they will not be cut off from energy supplies or other types of things. But again, their model for doing it is very, very different, led very much by, in some cases, by the Chinese private sector, supported by official assistance, in other cases by official programs. So what they're looking at is a system where they're gaining significant influence around the globe without having the need to have expensive alliances.
My name is Sven. But the Road and Belt Initiative, that appears to me is like they're trying to create another global norm, sort of competing with the U.S. and the Western culture. And I mean, it's like the Malaysia, when they sell coconut oil, they have to pay it in Chinese system as well as the SWIFT system. And a lot of countries are, Brazil selling soybean to China, at the same time they're aligned with us on security side. And Singapore is handling their finances, at the same time they're strongly aligned with us. So do you feel that they're creating a new norm of their own that competes against the SWIFT and the kind? And how is that perceived by Chinese? Are they fully aware of what's going on with their party?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things I remember seeing is that if we roll back the clock, 20 years, there was all this discussion about internationalization of the renminbi and creating Shanghai as this financial center to rival Hong Kong and to rival London and New York. And then that project of internationalization or globalization of the renminbi kind of died because China realized actually there are some real advantages to be gained by having a closed capital account and not having a freely floating sort of renminbi. Then if we look and see what happened during the opening sort of months and year of the Ukraine conflict, I think China was surprised at how quickly, sort of the West, quote unquote, was able to sort of unify and sort of, I don't want to use a pejorative term, but I know another term, weaponize the global financial system in ways that complicated life for the Russians, right? Cut off Russia's access to dollars, to capital, again, to global capital markets. And China was surprised at how quickly that came together. And so they sort of doubled on their sort of, approach to how do we avoid having that happen to us? And so starting then, China really began in earnest to look for ways to insulate itself or to find alternatives or build alternatives to sort of the dollar-based New York system that the U.S. uses for sanctions and that other countries use for sanctions. So they've got a lot of different tools that they're using to do that. They're building a direct alternative that they do with some countries. You talked about something that's partly related to that, but also partly related to just boosting trade, and that is increasingly organizing agreements with other countries where they can do trade in renminbi, usually because they'll have a swap arrangement or those types of things. And so those are becoming much more pronounced. So all that is to say, China recognizes that it has a vulnerability due to the U.S. dollar-based trading system, and they're actively working to make sure that the U.S. could not, should the U.S. desire to, weaponize it against them.
Great talk. Thank you very much. Back to the main point of this stuff is hard, this trade, and it's complicated. And I'm trying to get to all those people when I read about a new sanction or an export control in the Commerce Department or USTR.
Yeah.
It's impossible for them to figure out which of so many cockroach-like Chinese companies are doing what.
Yep.
And it made me think of back when I was working a dozen years ago, the Bush government and then George W. Bush and then the Obama government had these dialogues with China, the strategic and economic dialogue. And at one point when the Obama administration was there, I think there were, embassy people said, 116 different dialogues on health policy or real estate or labor or all that. And I know that a lot of them fell away. I'm just curious what mechanism, because you spoke about the difficulties of the government now working on this, what competency there is and what mechanisms there are.
Yeah, not many.
Oh, and the expression you were looking for was 种瓜得瓜. If you plant melons, you get melons. That might be what the U.S. government.
So, quick story. I've just moved to the China desk, and John Kerry has just become Secretary of State. And he's on his first visit to China as Secretary of State. And as all of you know, back then the relationship was different than it is today. Every Chinese government meeting follows the exact same protocol. And it's actually pretty efficient. But so I don't mean to make light of it, but they all follow the same protocol. It is always in a room that is shaped like a U. And at the point of the U at this spot will be the Chinese leader, and at that spot will be the U.S. dignitary. The Chinese delegation will be in a straight line down this one, maybe there's 2 rows, and on the U.S. delegation on this side, maybe there's 2 rows, and the press will be at the back, and in between us will be a giant flower pot. So in case I am too tempted to sort of like look directly at you, I am reminded that, I will have to lean forward to sort of say, and that's every Chinese meeting, but trust me, it works. It's not a bad system. And then the protocol of the meeting is, and sorry, Bob knows this, but for those of you who haven't been to these meetings, it's important to know. There's a protocol to how the meetings roll. And the way the meetings roll is the Chinese dignitary will say, this is not your first trip to China. And I know you already know all about China, but I'm going to tell you anyway. And then they will look forward, and they will talk about all the stuff that you already know about China. And then your job is to say, yes, and I know you already know all about whatever, and then you do that. Well, this particular meeting, one of his first big meetings, it was in the Great Hall of the People even, so a big, serious meeting. The Chinese side says, as they're supposed to, leans forward and says, I know you've been to China many times. You know a lot about China from your time in the Senate and elsewhere. And then he's supposed to say, but I'm going to tell you anyway. And instead he says, do you know how many dialogues we have, high-level dialogues between our 2 countries? And John Kerry is looking at those of us who wrote his papers like, you can only do so much prep. And he's like, a lot? And the Chinese official said, we have 99. And we're out there like counting, right? And so, of course, we immediately have to count, right? And we had, it was 100 and something, right? It may have been 116, 100, I can't remember. And so, yeah, so a lot of the bedrock was trying to create an atmosphere where the Chinese, out of habit, would talk to the U.S. And the goal under the Obama administration, where all these things proliferated, was the idea was there's some really big things we disagree with China on. But how do we deal with those? The way we're going to deal with those is we're going to work with them on so many other things that it will dwarf these problem areas. And the Chinese will realize we've got more to gain by working together with the U.S. Let's shrink these problem areas and let's work on the others. And so, so just very briefly, it was very much, I know I was working on this in Washington, this was very much an all carrot, no stick approach, right? It was, we're not going to push China too hard on these other things because we're going to show them all these advantages. So all carrots, not many sticks. End of the Obama administration, right? Hillary's about to run for president. We do our quadrennial policy review and we're looking, how did we do on our China policy? And by almost all the objective measures we had set, we were failing, right? Whether we're talking about, market access, whether we're talking about human rights, whether we're talking about China getting along with its neighbors, whether we're talking about, a host of other things, we could not really say that it was working. But you don't go into an election saying, hey, you know what, come and vote for Hillary. She was part of this that created this policy. We want a do-over. So, of course, you stay the course. But then when the Trump administration comes in, you say, you know what, this didn't work. So what happens with the Trump administration? Trump administration comes in and says, no. We're going to do things differently. After a couple of sort of policy starts and stops, the Trump administration said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go for all sticks. We're going to go for tariffs. We're going to go for export controls. We're going to put pressure on the China every way we can. And that is what's going to get us where we want to go with China. So we went from all carrots to all sticks. And, by the end of the Trump administration, due respect, we had the phase one trade deal that really wasn't much. And that wasn't really implemented. And then so Trump is out. And now you've got the Biden administration comes in. And now we've got some very smart students. And so I'm going to ask you, you're now looking, what should our China policy be? And you're like, we tried carrots and it didn't work. And we tried sticks and it didn't work. What do? Give up, okay? That was one option. And that's what they did for a big part of the first part of the Obama, for the Biden administration. But then what did they do? What do you do if you can't use carrots and you can't use sticks? Oh, come on.
Meet them where you're at and offer something that people will share.
Okay, well, maybe.
Carrots and sticks?
What's that?
Carrots and sticks?
Kind of, all right.
Well, I was going to say, based off particularly the book chapter for this particular topic, especially some of the graphs, it seems like very much the sticks continue in terms of, specifically the amount that tariffs were being put on between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration.
Okay.
You
so
improve
that
your
can
own
be-
act.
What's that?
You improve your own act.
Okay, so that's part of it. So eventually, the Biden administration realized, you know what? Carrots aren't going to work and sticks aren't going to work. So what do we have to do? This is where the idea of competition came from. And so how are we going to compete? We're going to invest in ourselves so we can compete better. We're going to work with friends and allies so we work together. And then we're going to compete. And there are all kinds of issues with this, but this is where the idea of competition came through. And there's a lot to be said about that. But then you get, so that was the lesson that the Biden administration took, was we're not going to change China, we're going to compete. But the lesson from the Trump administration that they brought back in, was different. Their lesson was, we need bigger sticks. And so that's why they came out saying, we're going to do 232s and 301s and all this, and that was the approach. But at this moment in history, I think that the bigger stick approach hasn't really yielded the benefits that the administration was hoping for in China. In fact, in some areas, it's kind of backfired.
So I've been dying to ask COVID from a bat or a lab, but I'm not going to ask that.
Yeah.
As a father of three and reading the stories of the sort of shocking growth of the Chinese military, and you see the stories of we can build a submarine once a year, an aircraft carrier once a decade, and they're pumping them out monthly almost. What is the end game for China? What do they want militarily? And are we going to see fleets of the Chinese fleets in the Med or in the Caribbean. I mean, I keep thinking of the Bond villain in the end, world domination.
Yeah.
And, you know, what is their goal militarily? I get they want to outcompete everybody economically and probably replace the dollar as sort of the global currency. And that strikes me as inevitable. But the military piece, should we fear that?
So here's what I would fear. You're absolutely right. They can build planes, tanks, ships at a rate that the U.S. can't even comprehend. And even if we're working with, sort of allies around the world, that's still really hard if we're going to go hard power to hard power, meaning them ship for ship, tank for tank, missile for missile, especially if they control the rare earths, right? And so the worry is that, and it's hotly debated, what's China's end game? What seems to be, I think, fairly clear, though there are people who would absolutely disagree with me on this, so I don't want to minimize that, that really right now what China wants is China wants the same thing that the U.S. wanted when it built up its military. It wants to be sort of left alone, and it wants to be able to defend itself against outside sort of leverage. But then the question becomes, as we may have seen with other countries, do you get mission creep? Does it become more coercive? And I think the jury is very much out, but that is a real and legitimate worry that if you're a Pentagon planner, that you have to have, is you absolutely cannot assume that the Chinese are going to be benign, where Chinese military doctrine is, how do we, deny, say, the 7th Fleet access inside of the, first island chain and et cetera. So I don't think we know what their end game is, but we do know that their goal is to eliminate the ability of the U.S. to apply coercive measures via the military on China.
Great, thank you. I want to wrap by asking a question. I'm going to try asking a question on behalf of the students here. USM is doing yeoman's work in public policy education, but I remember coming down to Washington from New Jersey and trying to break into it, and I'm sure you've got similar memories coming to Washington from Idaho. What's one piece of advice, or even multiple pieces of advice, you would give to a young person who's looking to work in government or public or foreign policy?
One, do it. Go to Washington. And number two, having interviewed both in government and out of government and others, lots of people going into jobs, people will come out and you'll have a really similar background, right? You'll have, similar degrees, similar sort of work experience. And I can tell you that the thing that sort of sells is, at the end of the day, because there's so much similar, it's the whole attitude and eagerness and sort of just sort of being engaging makes a difference. Being interested and knowing sort of the topic and being prepared, all of that's, I think, really important. But one of the great things I think about Washington, and it's probably true for New York and other places, is there really are just a lot of opportunities for internships, externships, volunteer opportunities, and all of that kind of gets you into sort of a space where you can kind of find a niche that works. So I would say, yeah, go find something, do it, and be enthusiastic and do it well. And that, I
Is the
think,
government hiring? It sure sounds like they're firing.
government's not hiring.
It's not just government though. Washington is is a whole ecosystem, and so right now, yes, like it's bloodshed in the government markets. Everyone's trying to get a job on the Hill because that's the only place where people can find work, and you have people that are way overqualified doing kind of like staff, legislative assistant jobs. But there's places like the U.S. China Business Council. There's policy shops all around Washington or other places where you can get a start and kind of learn your policy, get your policy chops, and start meeting people, start doing interns, do work that's budget neutral for Senate, for the Capitol Hill as an internship, and start making your connections and talking to people and going out and building your network. So I think that just because the government's not hiring, there's still plenty of fascinating stuff to do.
And don't be afraid to take risks, like taking this for credit, right?
I would
Yes.
agree with all of that. I would just add one thing. So
Yep,
Chris's
go ahead.
advice was great. Listen to what Chris said, not what I said. I see the world through a very narrow lens. I'm all China all the time, all trade all the time. And what I see right now, given the sort of era of the sort of roller coaster in U.S. China relations and all the tension in U.S. China relations, people who sort of have their China chops and sort of how understand the policy and all that, right now are doing really well. And this is when I was back at a law firm, people who could do China, full employment. People who are doing consulting on China, wow, absolutely full employment, and certainly a lot of the policy shops. So I think looking around at the areas that still are important and where things are growing, that's kind of where you need to focus.
So thank you to our speaker for the wealth of knowledge. Thank you to our moderator, Chris Barr, Vice President, fresh from 13 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you to the students for being here, for their questions. Thank you to the audience and our members. Thank you for caring enough to come out here to be interested about what is happening in the world, about our relations with the world, because regardless of whatever political persuasion you come from, what happens out there is going to impact you here. And so we need the opportunity to listen and understand, because the future is connected with China and the rest of the world. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening, and I hope to see you back here next Thursday for Europe and Ukraine and the future of European security. Another minor important topic. Thank you.